Bouncy Castles. A place for old and young people to jump around, do cool backflips and crash into the floor, all without the fear of hurting yourself. At least until another person crashes into you, hits you with the elbow to the head, and everything is getting very sad very fast. Nevertheless, a fun concept of physical entertainment, and one I always found very underrepresented in video games. While I did find this interesting game, at least including a bouncy castle to some degree, I wasn't able to find any actual representation of the core selling point, jumping around on an elastic surface and crashing into other people. So, about almost half a year ago, I asked myself, why not try to make such a game myself? How hard could it be? I mean, bouncy castles are not hard by design, so not too hard, I guess? And that's why in today's video, I will show you how I made a local multiplayer bouncy castle game, without a castle to be honest, but still with a lot of bouncing around. So, without further ado, let's bounce right into it. So, where to start? When I started fiddling around with the idea about 6 months ago, all I knew was that I wanted to emulate some kind of bouncy floor behavior. Player characters would be able to drop into the floor and then be catapulted back into the air. I had no idea what the exact gameplay loop should look like later on, but I wanted it to include this bouncy floor behavior. Now, it would be very easy to just put a Unity physics material with a lot of bounciness on a rigid body and voila, the player is now a rubber ball. But what I wanted was that the environment, the floor, would also be a part of the experience and be affected by the player. The floor should be elastic and get squeezed when an object lands on it and then expands and push the object away from it. So what I needed was some kind of soft body implementation, the very opposite of a rigid body. Since Unity, the game engine I usually use, doesn't provide something like that out of the box, and I never tried to implement any kind of soft body behavior before, I expected this to be the most difficult and time-consuming part of the project. Every project starts with some research. I scoured the internet to find some information, and after a while I came across this video by the YouTuber Gonky. From this video I learned that you can simulate a soft body by using a lot of rigid bodies and then connecting them via springs to form a desired shape. This approach is called a particle spring mass model, and it looked really promising to me. I went straight into Unity trying to implement something like that. So I quickly coded a spring behavior, and then, using sphere rigid bodies, I built the simplest possible shape, a triangle. Now, if we want to be really generous, I guess someone could already call this a soft body. Job done. Mission accomplished. Okay, a triangle is nice, but not really what I would call an elastic soft body. So, the next experiment was the square, which also worked as expected. But now I was curious to see how a real 3-dimensional spring body would work and how it would react if I let another solid rigid body fall on it. So I programmed a little procedure that would then automatically build a cuboid soft body of freely adjustable dimensions. Here we go. Time to give it a try. Now, it does work like an elastic soft body to some degree, but there's quite an obvious problem. The system tends to collapse and gets messed up whenever the rigid body hits the soft body with a certain amount of force. I assumed that I could get this to work somewhat better if I fiddled around with different spring strengths, constraints and configurations in general, but I also wasn't too sure that this approach would either scale very well or be reliable enough for an actual physics-based video game mechanic that would not glitch out from time to time. While I was a bit disappointed that I did not magically create the perfect bouncy floor I dreamed of, I was lucky enough to have another idea. Instead of creating a real soft body, I maybe could just fake one. Let me explain. So instead of having an interconnected network of springs and rigid bodies like I tried before, maybe it would be enough to just have a 2D grid of vertically fixed springs pointing up. Then I could wrap a procedurally generated mesh around that and it would almost behave like a soft surface? Question mark? This would come with some obvious drawbacks. Like it would only be elastic on one axis, and since those springs are not connected to each other, a colliding rigid body would only affect the springs the body is touching. But it would still be an elastic floor to jump on. And maybe I could later fake some of the mentioned drawbacks too. I was excited enough about this new idea that I decided to give it a try. So I recycled the spring code I programmed for the spring mass model and set up a little tool to create a grid of springs. So it's a bit difficult to see what my tool did build here, but I'll describe it for you. All the blue dots you can see on the ground are where the vertical springs are placed. The other end of the spring is connected to a currently invisible box rigid body. I then created a procedurally generated mesh based on the position of those bodies, which is the yellow surface area you can see. So let's throw some balls on the fake soft body and see how well it works. Now, that's what I would call an elastic surface. But there are still some very obvious problems. First of all, the springs are a bit too weak and also need way too much time to get back to a resting state. And if the springs at some point reduce their length to 0, they will not expand again and be just stuck. Not perfect, but also not impossible to fix by changing some of the spring parameters and then programming it so that this stuck situation is no longer possible to happen. So, next iteration step, let's have a look at it. Oh yeah, much better than before. Here you can now also see the mentioned top end boxes of the springs, which turn green whenever another solid rigid body touches them. At this point of time I also changed something else about the springs, which turned out to be quite important. To make the surface more bouncy in general, I made it so that the springs are weaker when they shorten and then become stronger when they start to expand. So bodies can sink in more easily and then bounce back with more force that was applied to the springs in the first place. Now, this is physically not quite correct. Maybe a bit cheated. But we're still making video games here, so why would we care about these lame laws of thermodynamics? What you can now also see is that when the ball hits the body, every spring, which is not touched yet, gets a bit longer. I added this to fake the effect of a squeezed balloon type body that expands everywhere it is not squeezed. The next thing I wanted to do was to elaborate on the procedurally generated surface. So I added some borders to it. The border mesh also reacts to the squeezed parts of the surface, as you can see here, but I did want it to be static on the bottom position. It was a bit finicky, but I was able to get it working. I honestly can't explain why, but I still find it super satisfying to just watch the border surface getting squeezed this way. I then improved the surface building tool and made it so that I could set the resolution of the border and also curve it based on just a simple Unity animation curve. Now that the border surface was curved, I also wanted the top surface to be somewhat bumpy, so that the body reflects more closely the floor of a Bouncy Castle thingy. To make it somewhat short, let's just say that it took me a while and a lot of different iterations until I got it working correctly, but in the end I was happy with the result. I was able to set up the resolution of the bumpy sections in my tool, and all the spring lengths in those sections would then be adjusted to a defined height difference based on another animation curve. As you can now also see, at this point I already started to do some art and created this cute frog buddy in a Super Monkey Ball as a potential player character. Neat! I also added some basic input for the frog to test the bouncy surface a bit more thoroughly. I was very happy and actually a bit surprised with how reliable the system worked already. One thing I tried that did not really work was to make it so that whenever the player squeezes some of the soft body springs, neighboring springs also squeeze a little bit. My idea was that this would make it a bit more realistic looking, but my first attempt went let's just say it did not work as intended. I'm sure I would be able to get this working somehow, but I put that on the nice to have list for future Pascal for the moment. So, I somehow accomplished my mission of creating a Bouncy Castle-esque elastic soft body surface, and now it was time to put some actual gameplay on top of it. The big question was, what kind of game do I want to make? All I knew was that it should include the bouncy floor, obviously, and I was also really happy with the frogger in a ball that I just added for testing purposes. So the first idea that came to my mind was to make a local multiplayer game. A local multiplayer game where the goal is to dash into other players and then to make them leave the floor and sink into the water. Quite simple. So I started by adding support for multiple controllers and then added a second player character to the scene. After that, I programmed input for a dash attack and it worked quite well. Another input I added, which is quite important, is that players are able to add negative vertical force to their characters, using the right trigger on the controller. So, with good timing, players are able to stomp into the ground and then when the button is released at the correct moment, they will jump higher than before. Not gonna lie, it was a bit difficult to test a local multiplayer game all by myself, but since I live alone, that's all I could do. I just put all my faith into the belief that it would actually make fun when there is another person controlling player 2. After the dash attack was working, I then added a shadow projection to the character, so that it's easier to understand where the player characters are in relation to the ground. Now, besides the water surrounding the playing area, the game scene was pretty empty and I wanted to add at least somewhat of a setting, so I decided to go for a Caribbean island flare setting, since I thought this would be very fitting for this kind of gameplay. A little peek behind the curtains at this point. I was kinda crunching at this point of time and at this weekend in particular because there was a local game dev meetup coming up at the 5th of October and I really wanted the game to be in a state so that I could present it to the other attendees and find out if the game is actually fun. So I rushed into Blender, quickly modeled some fairly simple assets, and with the little time I allowed myself to spend on additional art, I came up with the scene. Not particularly great, but I would say it's something. Then I went back to Blender and did something I had not done for a long time, animating a 3D character. I did rig and animate several characters in Blender some years ago, but I almost forgot the entire workflow, so I had to learn it from scratch again. But thankfully there are good YouTube tutorials, and it did not take me that much time to pump out some super basic and not very polished but okay looking animations for a frog buddy here. Another important thing that was missing was UI. So I also crunched that out and I think it turned out quite okay for the little amount of time I had. In the UI, for both players, you can see two other features I implemented: jumping and hovering. So jumping is pretty self-explanatory. If the correct button is pressed, the player will jump while being mid-air and then has to wait until a cooldown period is over. Hovering, on the other hand, is an ability which allows the player to reduce the player character's gravity, so it will kind of float gently to the ground instead of falling at regular speed. Now this is a stamina-based ability since it happens over time, and if the UI bar is empty, the player will stop hovering. I was hoping that with this set of movement-based abilities, there was some ground for strategic and fun gameplay, where for example one player dashed at the other, but then a well-timed jump would let the other player evade it. The time had come. I somehow made it so that the game was ready for the IndieTreff meetup I was planning to attend. By the way, it's called the IndieTreff and is located in Hamburg, Germany. After 2 years of the COVID pandemic and several lockdowns, this was the second time the event held place in person this year, and for me it was the first time presenting a game to other people for at least several years. So I was quite excited to see how everyone liked this little prototype game I made. And what can I say? Most people seemed to have a really good time. Now, I did a little oopsie. Except for this little clip, I did not record a lot of footage of people actually playing the game and reacting to it. So here's some stock footage of people enjoying video games. What was really cool about presenting the game to other people was of course all the good feedback I received. For example, the UI was not really that helpful since players tend to always look at the character and don't have the time to look in the corner to see which abilities are ready to use. It would be better if there was some kind of notifications on the player character itself. But overall, I think it was totally worth it to explore this idea, and I'm quite happy with the result and the positive feedback I received. Now you might ask yourself, this meetup was in October and this devlog released 2 months later in December. Why did it take me so much time to wrap this up and release this video? Because we're not quite finished yet. Despite the fact that my personal life over the last 2 months was quite stressful, not in a bad way though, I wanted to work a little more on the game and especially on a Christmas themed version that I could then release on time in December. Now, while I was able to create a bunch of Christmas assets and put them into the game, I did not achieve nearly as much as I hoped to. I also wanted to add power-ups, better UI and different characters. But this was sadly not possible and now has to wait for a future update. Nevertheless, the current Christmas version of the game is now online on itch and you can find the link in the description. It's a really rough alpha version and you totally have to read the instructions on the itch page to understand how to play it. It now also has a name, by the way. Bouncy. Very creative, I know. I would really like to work more on Bouncy in the future, but for now I'll switch again to another project I'm excited about, and I sincerely hope that the next video on this channel won't take ages again. Like I already mentioned in the last video, over the last year I discovered that working on multiple smaller projects works at the moment better for me and my mental health than just focusing on one bigger game like Exocolony. So videos in general take more time, but for next year I really hope I'll be able to upload in a more regular manner again. No promises though, we just have to see how it works. I really hope you enjoyed this little journey and I really hope that we will see each other again next year on this channel. Until then, I wish all of you a happy holiday season and have a good time. Bye!